"Get that kid out of here, he's ruining everything." Daniel Hughes, the CEO, barked as his son Ethan's cries echoed through the lavish ballroom. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as every eye in the room shifted uneasily toward the child. A stark contrast to the polished glass and sparkling chandeliers. Ethan, just 10 years old, gripped his father's sleeve, tears streaming down his face as he struggled with the overwhelming noise of the crowded event. His hearing impairment had always made these grand social gatherings feel like a battleground, a place where he was misunderstood and ignored. Daniel, the powerful figure at the head of the table, had long since grown tired of the disruption. His reputation was built on control, and in his eyes, Ethan's condition was nothing more than an inconvenience. The guests, all top investors and powerful figures, murmured amongst themselves, avoiding eye contact with the crying boy. A woman in the back, her eyes trained on the scene, couldn't help but notice the injustice unfolding before her. Monica Davis had seen her share of hardship, but this was something different. She had spent the better part of her life learning how to be invisible, how to navigate spaces where her presence didn't matter. She was a waitress working at the hotel where this high-profile event was being held. Her daughter, Jasmine, who had been quietly sitting by the bar, watching her mother work, stood up. The quiet strength in Jasmine's eyes caught Monica's attention for a brief moment. Jasmine was 10, much like Ethan, and just as quiet. The difference, however, was that Jasmine had never felt the sting of exclusion the way Ethan had. She had learned early on how to communicate with those who couldn't speak, through the language of the hands. As she slowly approached the boy, the room seemed to quiet, as though the energy shifted with her movement. She stood beside Ethan and with calm precision signed, "Are you okay?" Her fingers moved gracefully through the air, the signs fluid and natural like a dance. Ethan stopped crying for a moment, looking up at the young girl with confusion. The silence was palpable, and for the first time that evening, all eyes turned not toward the wealthy CEO, but toward the little girl who had dared to speak without words. Monica, standing nearby, couldn't help but smile with pride as Jasmine continued to comfort Ethan with her gentle signs. The world may have ignored her, but Jasmine had a voice, one that transcended the barriers of sound. As Daniel watched, a flicker of realization crossed his face. His son, the one he thought had nothing to offer in the high-stakes world of business, was now being comforted by a girl who was invisible to him, just another waitress daughter. Yet Jasmine's words, though silent, spoke louder than any of Daniel's negotiations ever could. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and relief. For the first time he felt seen. And for the first time Daniel saw something he had never considered. His own child needing something beyond wealth, beyond influence. He needed kindness. He needed connection. Monica stood in the corner, her eyes never leaving Jasmine as the young girl comforted Ethan. It was a quiet moment, one that spoke volumes. She could see the tension in Daniel's face, the frustration that was slowly turning into something else. Something like respect, maybe even awe. Jasmine had always been strong, even as a little girl. Monica had taught her everything she knew about resilience, how to survive in a world that didn't always understand or appreciate you. Jasmine had taken those lessons and made them her own. Watching her now, speaking with her hands, was a reminder of why Monica kept going. It wasn't for the tip or the respect she never got. It was for Jasmine, the little girl who saw the world differently, who understood what it meant to connect with others, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. Ethan had stopped crying. He was still looking at Jasmine, his confusion slowly giving way to calm as he realized that she was offering him something his father couldn't, understanding. And in that moment Monica knew that Jasmine had done what no one else could. She had reached him. It wasn't the first time Jasmine had proven herself in ways others didn't expect. As a young child, she had always been observant, noticing things that others overlooked. When Monica had been struggling, working late hours at the hotel, it was Jasmine who stayed up, studying by the dim light of a single lamp. She had a natural gift for languages, something Monica never understood until one day Jasmine started speaking in French, then Spanish, then Italian. The way Jasmine picked up languages was like magic. It wasn't just the words she learned, it was the way she could communicate without them, the way she could make others feel heard, seen, understood. It was as if she spoke a language no one had taught her, but one she had always known. Daniel watched Jasmine with growing interest, though he didn't show it. He was a man who relied on logic, on control, on the power of money. But here, in this moment, he was seeing something that money couldn't buy: connection. Real, raw human connection. He couldn't quite grasp it at first, but he could feel the shift. Ethan's tears had stopped, and he was no longer clinging to his father's sleeve. Instead, he was sitting quietly beside Jasmine, his small hand resting on her arm. The room around them had gone silent, all eyes now on the girl who had taken charge of the moment without saying a word. Monica could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her as well. She had always been invisible to people like Daniel, people who had power and influence and a world that revolved around them. But Jasmine had just done something Monica never could. She had shifted the energy of the room. And in doing so, she had proven something that Monica had always known deep down: that strength doesn't always come from the loudest voice or the most expensive suit. Sometimes it comes from the quietest person in the room, the one who isn't afraid to be herself. Monica's heart swelled with pride, but she also felt a pang of sadness. It was clear that Jasmine, despite her gift, would never be truly accepted in spaces like this. People like Daniel would always see her as a servant's daughter, no matter how much she achieved or how many languages she spoke. But Jasmine had something that they couldn't take away: her dignity, her strength, her heart. And that was something Daniel couldn't ignore for much longer. Monica knew this was just the beginning. Jasmine had opened a door that would never be closed again, and she had done it with nothing more than a simple act of kindness. The room was still silent, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer about Ethan's tears or Daniel's frustration. It was about the quiet strength of a girl who had made. Everyone realized something they had all overlooked: true power doesn't come from money. It comes from the ability to connect with others, to show them that they are valued, no matter who they are or where they come from. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his mind racing as he watched Jasmine and Ethan. The room had shifted from an awkward tension to something entirely different. He felt his pulse quicken as he realized something he had never truly acknowledged before: the power of kindness. Jasmine, a young girl who should have been invisible in a room full of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world, had somehow turned the entire atmosphere upside down. He had built his empire by dominating the conversation, by pushing people around, by making them feel small so he could feel big. But here in front of him was a little girl who had done the opposite. She had made him feel small. It was a feeling he wasn't used to. He cleared his throat, trying to push the unease away. Ethan, his son, sat silently beside Jasmine, his hand still resting gently on her arm. For the first time that evening, Daniel saw a calmness in his son's eyes that had been missing for so long. The boy, who had often been overlooked and dismissed because of his disability, was now connected to someone in a way that Daniel had never been able to connect with him. It hit him like a wave, the realization that he had been too focused on building his business, on controlling every aspect of his life, to notice his own son's pain. The very thing he had always feared, losing control, was happening right before his eyes. And it wasn't because of a deal or a competitor. It was because of a young girl who had offered her time, her patience, and her kindness to a boy who had been struggling in silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had always been the one to lecture others about leadership, about power, about strength. But in this moment, it was clear that true strength didn't come from the position you held in the room, or the wealth you accumulated over time. It came from the ability to see others, to hear them, to connect with them on a level that transcended all the surface-level things that people like him valued. Jasmine's quiet presence had done more than simply stop Ethan's tears. She had made Daniel see that he had been missing the most important thing in life: empathy. He watched as Jasmine turned to him, her gaze steady and confident. She had no idea how much she had just taught him in the span of a few minutes. She wasn't just a waitress's daughter. She wasn't just a girl who could sign. She was a reminder of what it meant to be human, to be kind, to be understanding. It was a humbling realization for Daniel. He had spent his life climbing to the top, fighting for success, and yet, in this moment, he felt like he had a lot to learn. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words felt inadequate. How could he explain the shift that was happening within him? How could he express the gratitude he felt for this young girl, this stranger, who had shown him something he had never understood? Jasmine didn't need words to know that Daniel was struggling with his emotions. She simply smiled at him, A smile that spoke volumes, and in that smile, he felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. She had done something more powerful than he ever could have imagined. She had made him realize that there was more to life than power. There was more to life than control. There was more to life than wealth. There was connection, and that was something money couldn't buy. Daniel sat there in silence, his mind swirling. The room had gone back to its usual hum, the noise of clinking glasses and idle chatter filling the air, but he was no longer part of it. He was distant, lost in thought, reflecting on the way Jasmine had changed the atmosphere in a matter of moments. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to make the deals happen, to be the one who called the shots. But now, sitting in this grand ballroom, he felt something unfamiliar: vulnerability. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, and it unsettled him. He had spent so many years building his empire, pushing people around, manipulating circumstances to get what he wanted. But in the face of a young girl's quiet strength, he realized how hollow that pursuit had been. Jasmine had done more than calm Ethan's tears. She had reached a part of Daniel he didn't even know existed. She had broken through the armor he had so carefully built around himself. As he watched Jasmine and Ethan interact, his eyes softened. Ethan was no longer crying, and he looked at Jasmine with a sense of calm that Daniel hadn't seen in him before. For the first time, Ethan was connected to someone, not through his father's wealth or influence, but through a simple act of kindness. Daniel couldn't help but wonder how many other moments he had missed with his son. How many times had he been so consumed with his own success that he overlooked the need for genuine connection with those who mattered most? His thoughts were interrupted when Monica, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped closer. She smiled at him, and for the first time that evening, there was no judgment in her eyes. There was no condescension, no pity. Just a calm, knowing smile. It was as if she understood exactly what was happening inside him. Daniel's mind raced. He had spent his life building walls, erecting barriers between himself and the world around him. But now, in this moment, he felt the weight of those walls pressing down on him. He had been so focused on his power, his status, his wealth, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. To connect. To see the value in people beyond their titles or net worth. It was a hard truth to face, but in the presence of Jasmine's quiet strength, he couldn't deny it anymore. Monica's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've got a good one there," she said, nodding toward Jasmine, who was now gently guiding Ethan back to the table, her hand resting on his shoulder. "She's got a way with people, doesn't she?" Daniel nodded, though he was still lost in his thoughts. "I never saw it before," he said softly. Monica didn't respond right away, but her smile grew. She could see that Daniel was beginning to understand. Jasmine had taught him something that no business deal, no boardroom negotiation ever could. The power of human connection. The importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not just what they could offer or what status they could provide. Jasmine had reminded him of something he had forgotten. He had been so focused on winning, on accumulating power, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. And in that moment he realized that maybe, just maybe, his greatest success wouldn't come from the next big merger or deal, but from the relationships he built, the people he truly saw. It was a humbling realization, one that Daniel wasn't sure he was ready to fully accept, but it was one he couldn't ignore. He looked over at Jasmine again. She was smiling at Ethan now, her face radiant with a kindness that was completely unforced. It was the kind of smile that made him want to be better, to do better. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Hughes wasn't thinking about his next move in the boardroom. He was thinking about the next step he could take to be a better father, a better person. And that thought, that feeling, was more powerful than anything he had ever achieved in his business career. Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of the evening pressing down on him in a way he had never felt before. He had always been the one to control the narrative, the one to make things happen, but now, in the presence of Jasmine's quiet strength, he felt out of his depth. He wasn't sure what to do with the feeling, this unsettling realization that his life's work had been built on the wrong things. As he watched Jasmine interact with Ethan, he couldn't help but think about the years he had spent away from his son. He had always been so focused on the next big deal, the next business venture, that he had missed the moments that mattered. He had failed to truly connect with his own child, to understand what Ethan needed from him. And now, for the first time, Daniel was questioning everything he had ever thought was important. Jasmine, this young girl who had so much to offer, had done something Daniel couldn't even begin to do for his own son. She had reached him in a way that was so simple, so pure, that Daniel felt like he had been living in a fog all these years. The clarity was overwhelming. He turned to Monica, who had been watching him closely, her eyes full of understanding. "I've spent my whole life building walls," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "And I didn't even realize how much I was shutting out. Not just from the world, but from my son." Monica's expression softened. She didn't need to say anything. She had seen it all before. She had seen how power and success could blind someone to the things that truly mattered. But she also knew that change was possible. And she could see it in Daniel. He was beginning to understand, beginning to let go of the rigid control he had held onto for so long. "It's never too late," she said simply. Daniel nodded, but he wasn't sure if he believed her. He wanted to believe her. But the years of missed opportunities with Ethan felt like an insurmountable gap. Jasmine, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, turned to Daniel. She looked at him with a calmness that seemed to say everything without a word. There was no judgment in her eyes, no sense of superiority. She had simply done what she knew was right. She had offered a hand to someone in need without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It was a moment of grace, something that Daniel was beginning to grasp, albeit slowly. Ethan looked up at him then, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel saw his son's eyes filled with something other than sadness or frustration. There was a softness, a warmth that hadn't been there before. He realized that it wasn't just Jasmine who had changed the dynamic in the room. It was Ethan too. Ethan had opened up in a way that Daniel hadn't thought possible, and it was all because of Jasmine's simple act of kindness. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a shift in his chest. He had always believed that the key to success was in being the strongest, the loudest, the most commanding. But now he understood something completely different. The real strength came from vulnerability, from letting down your guard and allowing others to see you for who you truly were. And in that moment, with Jasmine standing before him and Ethan by his side, Daniel realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be perfect. What mattered was being there, truly being there, for the people who mattered most. Jasmine's quiet strength had shown him that, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he was ready to do better, not just for his business but for his family, for Ethan. It was a humbling realization, and one that would change the course of his life forever. Daniel sat back, feeling the weight of the evening settle around him like a blanket. The room was still full of life, but he felt strangely removed from it all. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the conversations, it all seemed distant now. His mind kept returning to Jasmine's simple act of kindness, the way she had so effortlessly connected with his son, Ethan. It was a connection that had been missing for so long, one that he hadn't even known his son needed until it was right in front of him. Daniel had always seen himself as a man of control, someone who could manipulate situations to his advantage. He had built his empire by being the one in charge, the one calling the shots. But now, sitting in this room, he realized that true control wasn't about power or dominance. It was about connection. It was about being present, truly present for the people who mattered most. He glanced over at Monica, who was watching him carefully. There was no judgment in her eyes, just understanding. She had seen this before. She knew how power could blind someone to the things that truly mattered. And yet, she also knew that change was possible. She had seen people grow, evolve, and change their perspectives when they were ready to. "You've got to stop being afraid of what you're feeling," Monica said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Daniel looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Monica smiled softly. "You're still holding on to this idea that you have to be in control all the time. But look at what just happened. You didn't control this moment. Jasmine did. And Ethan just needed someone to see him, to connect with him." Daniel's heart sank. He hadn't been there for Ethan the way he should have. He had spent so much time chasing deals, numbers, success, that he had forgotten what it meant to be a father. He had overlooked the most important thing of all, the connection with his son. "I don't know if I can change that," Daniel said, his voice full of regret. "I've missed so much." Monica's gaze softened. "It's not about changing the past. It's about being present now." You have a chance to make things right, to show Ethan that you see him, that you understand him. That's what he needs from you. Daniel swallowed hard. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. But for the first time he also felt something else, hope. He turned his attention back to Ethan, who was now sitting at the table with Jasmine, his laughter filling the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan was genuinely happy. He wasn't just going through the motions trying to please his father or hide his discomfort. He was just being himself, fully present in the moment. And it was all because of Jasmine, the girl who had come into their lives without any expectation, without any agenda. She had simply offered her kindness, her understanding, and in doing so she had changed everything. Daniel stood up, suddenly feeling the need to take action. He walked over to Ethan, who looked up at him with surprise. Daniel smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Hey buddy," he said softly. Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment, Daniel wasn't sure what his son would do. But then to his relief, Ethan smiled back. "Hi Dad," he said, his voice small but genuine. Daniel knelt down beside him, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm sorry I haven't been there for you," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "But I'm here now. And I want to be the dad you need me to be. I want to learn how to connect with you. Really connect with you." Ethan's eyes softened and he nodded slowly. "I know, Dad. I know." Daniel's chest tightened, but it wasn't a painful feeling. It was the kind of tightness that came from a long-awaited release. He had spent so many years pushing people away, hiding behind his power and success. But now, in this moment, he felt like he was finally letting go. He wasn't just the CEO of a billion-dollar company. He was a father, a man who was learning how to love and connect with his son in a way he had never done before. And that was something he couldn't buy with all the money in the world. Daniel walked back to his seat, the conversation with Ethan still hanging in the air. He had made the first step, but he knew it wouldn't be the last. It wasn't just about words. It was about actions. He had spent so many years focused on his business, his wealth, his empire, that he had forgotten to invest in the people closest to him. Jasmine had shown him what he had been missing all along. She had made him realize that what truly mattered wasn't the deals or the power. It was the relationships, the connections that he had neglected for so long. Monica's quiet wisdom echoed in his mind. You have to stop being afraid of what you're feeling. It wasn't just a lesson about being a better father. It was a lesson about being a better person, a better human. Daniel looked at his son again, watching him laugh with Jasmine. The joy on Ethan's face was something he hadn't seen in a long time. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing his son as an extension of his success. He was seeing him as an individual with his own needs, his own feelings. And that was a breakthrough Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for, but it was the one he needed. As the night wore on, Daniel found himself more and more aware of the people around him. The guests at the table, the staff who served them, they were no longer just faces. They were people, each with their own story, their own life. Jasmine's simple act of kindness had opened his eyes to the way he had been viewing the world all along. He had been looking at people through a lens of status, wealth, and power. But now he realized that lens was clouded. He needed to see the world through the lens of empathy, understanding, and connection. When the evening began to wind down, Daniel found himself standing near the door, his coat draped over his arm. He glanced over at Jasmine, who was laughing with Ethan, and for the first time, he saw her not just as the waitress's daughter, but as someone who had changed his life. She had taught him something valuable, something irreplaceable. He could never go back to the way he was before. He walked over to her, his footsteps slow but sure. She looked up at him, her face breaking into a warm, knowing smile. "You okay?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. Daniel hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But in the end he didn't need words. He nodded, then extended his hand to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jasmine smiled again, shaking his hand. "You're welcome," she said softly, but there was a quiet strength in her voice that spoke volumes. It was a moment of humility for Daniel, a moment when he understood that true power wasn't about control. It was about being able to see others, to recognize their worth, and to appreciate the connections that made life meaningful. As he left the building that night, Daniel's mind was clear for the first time in a long while. He didn't have all the answers and he didn't know exactly where the future would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer chasing the wrong things. He was chasing the things that really mattered. The days that followed the event felt like a slow, steady unraveling of the life Daniel had always known. He spent more time with Ethan, more time listening, really listening to what his son had to say. And with each passing day, the walls that Daniel had built around himself began to fall away, brick by brick. He no longer saw Ethan as just the son of a billionaire, a child who was supposed to be the future of his legacy. He saw him as a person with dreams, struggles, and a heart that longed for connection. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Daniel faltered, when his old habits kicked in, when his instincts told him to close off, to retreat into the comfort of his work. But he pushed through those moments, taking a deep breath and reminding himself that he had already made the most important change. He was there, truly there for his son. Monica had been a quiet force in his life, a grounding presence that kept him from losing sight of what mattered. She never judged him, never told him what to do, but she had a way of making him think about the bigger picture. One evening, as they were sitting in the hotel lounge, Monica looked at him with that knowing smile. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Daniel met her gaze and nodded. "I didn't know how much I needed this," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know how much I was missing, how much I had been ignoring." Monica's smile softened. "It's never too late. But you've got to keep showing up. Not just for Ethan but for yourself too." He didn't have an answer right away. The truth was he still wasn't entirely sure who he was now. He had spent so much time trying to build an image of himself that he had forgotten who he truly was underneath it all. But he was starting to figure it out. One evening as he was walking home from a long day at the office, Daniel stopped outside a cafe. He had passed it 100 times before, but tonight was different. He walked inside, greeted the barista, and sat at a small table by the window. The atmosphere was calm, the soft hum of conversation mixed with the low jazz playing in the background. It wasn't the flashy, high-powered world he was used to. It was simple. And for the first time in a long time Daniel felt at peace. He looked out the window, his thoughts drifting to Jasmine, the girl who had started all of this. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt connected to someone in such a pure way. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about kindness, about understanding. He had been so focused on the wrong things for so long that he had nearly forgotten what truly mattered. But now he had a second chance. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew that he wasn't going to waste it. The next few weeks were filled with small moments of change. Daniel spent more time at home with Ethan, taking him to the park, talking with him about his interests, his thoughts. They didn't always agree, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were connecting in a way they never had before. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences, moments where Daniel didn't know what to say. But there were also moments of laughter, of shared experiences, of true father-son bonding. Daniel had always prided himself on being a man of action. But he realized now that the most important actions weren't always the big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes the most meaningful things in life came from simply showing up, being present, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be there. And that was enough. Months passed and Daniel found himself in a new rhythm, one that felt foreign but incredibly fulfilling. His business was still thriving, but now his focus had shifted. He no longer spent every waking hour chasing the next big deal. Instead, he spent time with Ethan, with his family, finding joy in the moments that used to pass him by unnoticed. They were simple moments, dinner conversations, weekend outings, and late-night talks in the living room. But they were moments that built the connection Daniel had been so desperately missing. He noticed things now. The way Ethan's eyes lit up when they talked about his dreams. The way he laughed when Daniel made an awkward joke. Something Daniel would have once considered a failure, but now saw as a chance to share in the moment. The bond between them grew stronger each day. Daniel had learned that true wealth wasn't measured by bank accounts or business empires, but by the relationships that sustained you. He didn't need to control everything anymore. He didn't need to be perfect. What mattered now was showing up. He continued to spend time with Monica too. She had been a constant support, a reminder of the values he had almost forgotten in his pursuit of success. She never asked for anything in return, but Daniel knew that her presence had made all the difference. She had quietly guided him through his transformation, and now he felt like he was becoming the man he had always wanted to be. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the hotel's lounge, Daniel looked over at Monica and smiled. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said. Monica returned his smile, her eyes warm. "I never doubted you would," she replied. "It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It wasn't about making grand gestures. It was about being present, about learning to listen, and about embracing vulnerability." The world around him was still moving at its usual pace, but Daniel had found peace in a way that he never had before. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He wasn't chasing an ideal of success that didn't really exist. He was living for the moments that mattered. As time went on, Daniel's relationship with Ethan grew even stronger. Ethan began to open up in ways he never had before, sharing his thoughts, his hopes, and even his fears. Daniel really listened, and in doing so he gained a deeper understanding of his son, of himself, and of the world around him. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Ethan looked up at Daniel and said, "Dad, I'm glad we're spending more time together." Daniel smiled and put his arm around his son. "Me too, buddy. Me too." In that moment, Daniel realized that this was what he had been missing all along. The ability to just be with the people he loved, without distractions, without expectations. It was simple, but it was everything. As they walked home that day, side by side, Daniel knew that the journey he had started was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, and there would be moments when old habits resurfaced, but he was ready. He had learned that the true value in life came from the connections we built, the love we gave, and the moments we cherished. And he would never take those for granted again.